All right. Well, thank you all for coming out for this program, and I hope I make it modestly worthwhile because I think this is a critically important topic, and I want to start by establishing maybe some common ground. First of all, I think that the Russian invasion is wrong, illegal, unjustified, and in the view of some foreign policy analysts, an even greater sin is it's a mistake and a miscalculation. I'm not certain at all that Putin would have undertaken this war had he realized how this was going to play out. And I say that even if it turns out that he manages to accomplish something in the Donbass that he can claim to be a victory and bring the war to an end. Secondly, I want to say that Putin is a murderous leader, by some measures a gangster. But having said that, I think it's a profound mistake to attribute this war solely, maybe even primarily, to Putin's flaws. Third, I think the Biden administration has done an admirable job of trying to thread the needle here, of trying to provide support for Ukraine and resistance to an invasion, while at the same time trying to contain the war. Based on the front page article in the New York Times this morning, it seems more and more doubtful that the war is going to be contained. In the article this morning, many of the commentators were saying they think it's likely the war is now going to expand beyond Ukraine. In fact, it already has expanded into Moldova. And some of the objectives that the sides are articulating, more from our side, frankly, than from the Russian side, have expanded, not retreated. But even with all of those caveats, I still think the Biden administration is doing the right thing. And lastly, I think it is possible, maybe more possible than any of us imagined, or most of us imagined at the beginning of this conflict, that the result of this war may establish that some deterrence for aggressions in the future, and that the deterrence can be accomplished by, I hesitate to say non-military means, because certainly supplying military aid is a military mean, but without engaging in the war itself. But even if that good result comes out of this war, I think this war will have made the world a worse and more dangerous place afterwards. So you might ask the question, and that last comment sort of leads to it, is if you essentially agree with the policies that the government is currently pursuing, what's the point of the discussion? And the point of the discussion is twofold. One is that you've probably all heard of war games, and in the area of diplomacy and strategic planning, there's a comparable concept called red team concept. And the concept, and Kennedy used it during the Cuban Missile Crisis, is to delegate to a certain group of people the job of trying to best understand and reflect the view of your enemy or opponent, for the purpose of being better able to anticipate both their capabilities, their motivations, and their reactions to whatever steps you take. And secondly, because I think the world that we're going to have after this conflict ends, however it ends, is not going to be as good a world as the one that we had before it began. I think it will behoove us all to try to understand how it came about, what we might have been able to do to prevent it, what the Russians might have been able to do to prevent it, and perhaps even how to reconcile the legacy that the war will create, however it is resolved, because there'll be a legacy of anger, hatred, and division that we'll have to try to overcome in some way, and it's going to be difficult to do that if we don't understand how we got here. So that's why I wanted to do this program, and I basically divided into 4 parts, which my usual over enthusiasm probably maybe too much to cover in this one night. But first of all, I want to turn to 2 historical precedents to examine when we consider the history of this war, because just walking through the facts of who struck John over the past 20 years, I think will be more meaningful if we do that next week with some background and context. So I want to look at 2 historical precedents: World War I, where what was essentially a war that no one wanted and should have never been fought, and everyone thought before it started was unthinkable that it would happen. Not everyone, but most. Turned out to be unavoidable. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we avoided Armageddon, although based on facts that have come to light when we got access to the Russian records after the fall of the Soviet Union, when our own records were declassified, we came much closer to a nuclear war at that time than I think any of us probably appreciated at the time, even though I remember hunkering down under a desk in my school. Then I want to turn to the seeds of the conflict and explain how it started in 1991. And then I'd like to turn to a couple of, I'll call them lenses or conceptual frameworks in which to understand the conflict. And they don't all agree with each other. None of them are all right. Most of them are partly right. But I think to understand the conflict, you probably need to understand a little bit about all of them. And then I'm going to bring you to the United States view at the time that the Soviet Union dissolved on issues that are still before us now. So I guess we can put the slide up first or now.
One second.
Okay.
My computer is thinking of cooperating, but it's giving strong consideration to it without making a commitment. So let me see what I can do here.
Oh, maybe I have control because I just got a
No,
notice.
I think,
We co-hosts.
yeah, I think we're going to be good. One second. There we go.
Okay, and that's the right page to start on. And at the risk of boring you, I'm going to read 2 passages. The first is from a book written on the 100th anniversary of World War I by Margaret Macmillan, The War That Ended Peace. But it speaks to us today about why that history is relevant. She writes at the beginning of her book, "It's easy to throw up one's hands and say the Great War was inevitable, but that is dangerous thinking, especially in a time like our own, which in some ways, not all, resembles that vanished world of the years before 1914. Let me stop there for a minute and explain what she means. The period in Europe before the First World War was 100 years of the 100 most peaceful years in European history since the time of the Roman Empire. There were a few collateral wars during that period, but largely it was the most peaceful time in European history. And in Western civilization, including the United States, it was a period of exceptional growth, tremendous scientific and technological accomplishments, great accomplishments in literature and music. It was, to borrow the phrase from Dickens, the best of times, but it was also in some ways the worst of times, because Western civilization was in what, and if you've ever followed any of my other classes, my professor Carol Quigley, who was a profound influence on Bill Clinton, who also went to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown when I was there, called the Age of Conflict. Western civilization was under stresses because institutions in the civilization that accomplished certain social, economic, political, military objectives were not working as well as they had. There were a lot of stresses in the civilization, many driven by the transition from an agricultural society to an industrial society that had profound effects on changes of politics, economics, social relationships, etc. We are in, I think, unquestionably the same kind of period. The good news is Western civilization, according to Quigley, has gone through these times four times before and managed to reform ourselves. Russian civilization, on the other hand, which we'll get to, actually went through an age of conflict before First World War, like Western civilization was, but actually went into the next stage of, rather than reform, of authoritarian dictatorship, which was the communist regime. And that collapsed with incredible rapidity in the late 1980s and 1991. Those are the similarities. The additional similarity we have in an international affairs relation is that in the period before World War I, Great Britain was the dominant power, but it was confronted by rising powers, particularly Germany, but also Russia. And in those periods when there is a dominant power being confronted by a rising power, and in our case it's China, not Russia, those are periods that very often lead to war between those two powers. That's what she's talking about when she says that the period before World War I was in some ways, not all, resembles the vanished world of our period resembles the vanished world of the years before 1914. And she writes and continues, our world is facing similar challenges, some revolutionary and ideological, such as the rise of militant religions or social protest movements, others coming from the stress between rising and declining nations, such as China and the United States. We need to think carefully about how wars can happen and about how we can maintain the peace. Nations today confront each other as they did before 1914 in what their leaders imagined was a controlled game of bluff and counter-bluff. Yet how easily and how suddenly Europe went from peace to war in those 5 weeks in the summer of 1914 after the assassination of the Archduke. During previous crises, some as bad as the one of 1914, Europe had not gone over the edge. Its leaders and large parts of their people had supported them, had chosen to work matters out and to preserve the peace. What made 1914 different? And I think the answer to that question, as she says, has some lessons for us. First, and this is sort of ironic, as she mentioned in that passage, there were a series of escalating crises between European powers and Russia, which is a semi-European power, I guess you could say, in the 10 years before 1914, but they were resolved. And it's ironic, but the resolution of those crises had two effects. Each side came out of each crisis angrier than they were going in, because each side believed they'd been taken advantage of in the resolution of the prior conflict. And secondly, and sort of conversely, because all of those conflicts had been resolved, even as the conflict in the summer of 1914 escalated, people continued to believe that we've never gone over the edge before. Certainly someone's going to find a way, figure out a way to keep us from going over the edge now. I think that those two attitudes are partly, certainly from the Russian side, a sense of escalating anger. But I think on both sides, we've had conflicts with Russia, at least for the last 20 years now, that have been escalating. And we never resolve them, and both sides come out of the conflict thinking they've been taken advantage of and angrier than they were before with the other. And yet we also somehow think that that we won't go over the edge. Another similarity between that period of time and now was that people in that period thought that war was largely unthinkable. They just couldn't imagine that their leaders or they would be so senseless as to take them into a catastrophic war. Part of it was because the technology of war, as it existed then, was much greater technology in terms of military power. It was inconceivable to people that we would actually use that technology to slaughter people by the millions. But in fact, in World War I, as the war escalated, every available means of military technology, every weapon that was available was used, including gas warfare. The second reason people didn't think war would happen was there was a tremendous interdependence, economic interdependence between particularly the nations of Europe, but generally the world. And it was correctly perceived that each nation had there would be a tremendous economic cost to the war that certainly would cause people not to avoid war at all costs. And yet, we didn't. In fact, the amount of economic interdependence and trade that existed before World War I never regained in percentage terms the level that never regained after World War I, the percentage level that it had before World War I until now. Now we have reached a level of economic interdependence that equaled probably about 10 or 15 years ago and surpassed that existed before World War I. But it took 100 years to restructure it. A third factor was that during the period of the war, there was an escalating rhetoric of morality and honor. Your opponents are evil, that made compromise and avoiding war more difficult. And I want to read another passage, and I apologize if this is a passage written by a professor I had at Georgetown. His name was Quigley. It's the one that I referenced earlier that Bill Clinton talked about in one of his acceptance speeches as he and JFK as the two people most influential on him. And what he's talking about here is the transition from the type of war that existed mostly before World War I and the type of total war that World War I and World War II were. And he explains why it happened. And I think some of the explanations will resonate with our current situation. He says, with certain exceptions, the wars of the 18th and early 19th centuries had been struggles of limited resources for limited objectives. Now here's the ironic part. The growth of political democracy the rise of nationalism, and the industrialization of war led to total war with total mobilization and unlimited objectives. In the 18th century, when rulers were relatively free from popular influences, they could wage wars for limited objectives. I'm sorry, I lost my place. In the 18th century, when rulers were relatively free from popular influences, they could wage wars for limited objectives and could negotiate peace on a compromise basis when these objectives were obtained or appeared unattainable. Using a mercenary army which fought for pay, they could put that army into war or out of war as seemed necessary without vitally affecting its morale or its fighting qualities. The arrival of democracy and of the mass army required that the great body of citizens give wholehearted support for any war effort and made it impossible to wage wars for limited objectives. Such popular support could be won only in behalf of great moral goals or universal philosophic values, or at the very least, survival. At the same time, the growing industrialization and economic integration of modern society made it impossible to mobilize for war except on a very extensive basis, which approached total mobilization. The mobilization could not be directed toward limited objectives. From these factors came total war with total mobilization and unlimited objectives, including the total destruction or unconditional surrender of the enemy. And he goes on to point out that because of the total war, the international law precedents that had been developed in times of limited war, of not involving non-combatants, broke down completely in World War I, and then of course again in World War II, which was really just a continuation of World War I. And of course the ultimate in non-combatant casualties was when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, wiping out entire cities. Now, what concerns me, the point is that I have noticed that in every war that we have been involved in my lifetime, those wars have been justified by moral claims, by value claims, by various claims relating to survival, that if we lose the war, things are going to get dramatically worse. Usually, we've gotten into a number of small wars on the basis that the small wars, even though we didn't seem to have that much at stake in any of them, and I'm thinking of Vietnam and Iraq in particular, were important for some larger and bigger reason. Let me turn next to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will be the next slide. Armageddon wasn't avoided in World War I. It was avoided in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there's a couple of stories about that crisis that I think teach us something. There was at one point, we now have transcripts of the deliberations of the cabinet and the Security Council during that crisis. And at one point during the crisis, Kennedy was questioning the chiefs of staff primarily about if we do X, what will the Soviets do? And if they do Y, if we do Y, what will we do? And as he went through the steps of and at that time, the Joint Chiefs were recommending an invasion of Cuba. he went through the steps of the escalation of escalation, and it ended up with the Joint Chiefs saying, well, you know, probably the logic of where we're going is that we're going to end up in a nuclear war. And Kennedy, of course, expressed profound amazement. He said, well, how are we going to avoid that? And the answer was, well, hopefully cooler heads will prevail at some point. And that's why I think there is an incredible, almost inevitable logic to escalation. Because each side believes that if we just escalate, if we just apply more force, more power, more punishment, the other side will surrender, give up, stop. And it rarely happens until you get to the point where, as in World War I, you fought for 4 years and 20 million people have died, or World War II, and 70 million people have died. The other thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis was that there came a point in the crisis when the Russians had proposed a resolution, and they actually proposed it to an ABC News correspondent in Washington, that the Kennedy administration thought they could live with. And the proposal was essentially that the Russians would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States would publicly agree that it would never again invade Cuba. Kennedy administration thought they could do that. But then a subsequent communication came in, and the subsequent communication added an additional condition that we had missiles on the border of the Soviet Union in Turkey. And Khrushchev demanded that those missiles be removed as part of the price of ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was, at least publicly, not an acceptable point. And the question arose, which of these offers do we respond to? The accommodating offer or the more demanding offer? And even before those two offers, Khrushchev had written a letter to Kennedy accusing him of starting World War III, of nuclear war, and this would end in nuclear war, and all sorts of hot language. Without, I think, fairly say, without vilifying the enemy, we opted, at Robert Kennedy's suggestion, at least from my understanding of it for the most part, to respond to the more accommodating message and ignore the more incendiary or more difficult proposals. That led to an ultimate resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that gets me to the third point about political constraints on compromise. The proposal that the Soviets had made that we remove our missiles from Turkey as in return for their agreement to remove their missiles from Cuba was one that we could live with. In fact, we were planning to do that anyway. But Kennedy felt that he could not do that politically, that he couldn't be seen as responding to this pressure of missiles in Cuba by agreeing publicly to remove the missiles from Turkey. And the Russians, or the Soviets, were willing to accept that a secret promise that wouldn't be publicized and didn't come out until later, on the U.S. assurance that those missiles would be removed shortly after the Russians removed their missiles from Cuba. And that was done. But the point I'm getting to on that is that both the political constraints that exist, particularly in a democracy, because the Soviets were less constrained by democratic and political concerns. They could make concessions perhaps more easily, although Khrushchev lost his job over this 2 years later. But than in the United States. And here we are talking about the possibility of resolving a conflict that the Kennedy administration believed had a 50% chance of ending in nuclear war. And we were reluctant to make a concession because of the political costs of that concession, notwithstanding that risk. And that just identifies for you how the constraints that politics can play in managing a crisis like this. And that's one reason I will say that I want people to understand the complexities of this crisis, so that, frankly, I'm hoping that we as a nation will give the Biden administration whatever political latitude it needs to try to end this thing. The third thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis is, and we didn't know this until we got access to records later, how close we came to an actual nuclear attack. And it happened in three ways. First of all, we were flying U-2 flights over Cuba to monitor the missile sites. A direction had been given that if any of those U-2 flights were downed, the United States could attack Cuba without any further authorization from Kennedy. It didn't happen that way. Thankfully, Kennedy at the last minute changed his mind and said, no, I want to make this decision. If that attack had gone forward, what we didn't know at the time was that the Soviets had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, and their commanders in the field had been given authorization without any further order from the Soviet Union to launch tactical nuclear weapons against the United States if Cuba were attacked. Kennedy held off on that attack and didn't respond to the shooting down of that U-2 flight, and by that means avoided what could have rapidly escalated into a nuclear exchange. The second thing that occurred is there was a Soviet sub with nuclear arms off of our coast during the crisis. That sub was being subject to depth charge bombings from the surface, lost connection, I guess lost radio connection with its own commanders, but the commanders on the sub, and this is not real clear to me, but at least two, maybe one, the commanders on the sub had authority if they were attacked to launch a nuclear device at the United States. There were two officers on board. It's not clear to me from the description I read whether they both needed to approve the launch or only one needed to approve the launch. But the senior commander approved the launch. It didn't occur, and it's not clear, at least it wasn't clear to me from what I read, whether the senior commander's order was countermanded and just not followed, or whether he withdrew the order. But if that senior commander's order had been executed, we would have had a nuclear missile fired at the United States during that war. And then lastly, Castro actually wrote a letter to Khrushchev telling Khrushchev the time had come that neither the Soviet Union nor Cuba could tolerate American interference in Cuban affairs any longer, and it was time to launch the war, even though Castro believed that it would be a nuclear war. Castro later, 40 years later, said he regretted writing that letter in hindsight. The last thing I learned about the Cuban Missile Crisis, about how close we came, I never realized this, was apparently it was Robert McNamara's view at the time that the missiles in Cuba were not that great a threat to the United States, a point that he wrote about in one of his later books, acknowledging that was his view at the time and saying that in hindsight, he thinks it's even more true. I think we had like 3,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at the Soviet Union. They had 300 aimed at us. McNamara thought the extra 40 in Cuba were not material. And yet, looking back at this crisis and seeing how close we came, even in a circumstance where our own Secretary of Defense perhaps thought that it wasn't a war worth having, is a lesson for us now. Now let me turn to the seeds of the current conflict. This goes back to when the USSR dissolved in 1991. And remember, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact countries, the fall of the Berlin Wall occurred in 1989. The Warsaw Pact countries essentially broke away. The Soviet Union allowed them to break away from the Soviet Union between 89 and 91. And then in 91, the Soviet Union, the central government actually gave to the republics, Gorbachev gave to the republics, the decision of whether to remain in the USSR as it was, or to become independent countries, but in a confederation of states, of independent states, sort of like the American Articles of Confederation. To understand the problems that came out of that dissolution, imagine for a moment if the United States were to dissolve, a prospect that would seem almost completely absurd until maybe more recent periods. Analysts for the CIA have actually speculated now that we are on the road to a political dissolution, possibly. In any event, imagine that would happen. Imagine that a part of the United States, which clearly had been part of the United States for 200 years, were now to break off. What economic, military, political, and cultural issues would arise as to the relationships between the former New England states of the United States and the rest of the United States, or the Pacific Coast and the rest, or the South and the rest? Those are the kinds of problems and issues that Ukraine and Russia faced in 1991 when Ukraine made a decision to be an independent nation within the context of the Confederation of Independent States. Those issues between them have never really been resolved. They have been the source of a constant tension back and forth, both sides using a variety of means to influence the others. And we'll go through that history next week. But you can imagine, if you just think about it in terms of our own nation, you can imagine what kind of issues would resolve. And the expectations we might have that the New England states of America, were they to break away, wouldn't ally with a hostile, what we would, the rest of the United States would view as a hostile power. The other thing that happened in 89 and 91 was that the security structure in Europe that predated 1981 was based on the existence of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Both of those structures gave each side some level of at least perceived security. When the Warsaw Pact dissolved and when those nations left the Warsaw Pact, Russia, even the Soviet Union, before even it divided up, was subject to a much greater security risk, or perception of a security risk, than existed before. I mean, in essence, its security blanket was removed. As for NATO, there was serious discussion at the time that NATO be disbanded because it was no longer necessary. And in fact, in the NATO command, there developed a doctrine that if NATO didn't change its purpose and expand its purposes, it would and should perhaps be dissolved. But the bottom line was the vacuum that was created when the Warsaw Pact dissolved was over what's going to happen to that, what was essentially a buffer zone between the Western powers and West Germany was at that point the easternmost line of the Western power, and the Soviet Union, ultimately Russia. So the kinds of problems that exist between Ukraine and Russia are not attributable solely, maybe even not even primarily, to Putin. And let me read this passage. This is from the book Ukraine and Russia, From Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War. And this is a book that has been recommended by the people that are most enthusiastic or most militant in our current posture towards Russia and Ukraine, and people who consider us to have some responsibility for having created a situation. But this author has, I think, credibility on both sides, and he writes this: one important conclusion is that the strategy of awaiting the departure of Putin is unlikely to succeed. Russia's insistence on being a great power and a regional hegemon, as well as its claims over Ukraine, predate Putin's rise to power and are widely shared across the Russian elite and populace. The implication is that democracy will not lead Russia to abandon these aspirations. Indeed, only Boris Yeltsin's personal power held this agenda back in the 1990s. More broadly, the belief derived from the democratic peace theory that a democratic Russia will necessarily reach an accommodation with the West runs squarely into Russia's great power aspirations. So, and why is that important? Because if we thought that this war was solely attributable to Putin, and it may be that, and it's not, it's certainly significantly attributable to Putin, and it may be that removing Putin is a necessary step to getting Russia to reach some kind of compromise, but it may not be a sufficient step, because the point of view that he reflects is not a point of view that's unique to him. Now let me turn to Ukrainian history before 1991 to give you a little background on that. Ukraine has been a nation state for only a very brief period, basically during two times. One is since 1991, and the other was, I think, in a brief period of a couple decades in the middle of the 1800s or early 1800s. It has been an identifiable ethnic group within other empires or nations for over 1,000 years.
Ukraine's an identifiable ethnic group?
Yes.
Identifiable ethnic group.
Dave,
Yes.
excuse me, someone has joined the group and their microphone is on and it's overriding your talk. So whoever that is, could you please mute your computer? Thank you.
So the existing boundaries of the Ukraine, of what is now the Ukraine, were established by Lenin in 1921 and 22. Crimea, which is what the portion of Ukraine that Russia took back, in a sense, in 2014, was actually put into the Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev, who had been the leader of Ukraine before he became the leader of the Soviet Union. And the Soviets treated the Ukraine economically and military as part of the same nation. Their most important naval base, which is on the Black Sea, is in Ukraine, was in Ukraine and was maintained in Ukraine. Economic infrastructure to serve the Soviet Union was built in Ukraine. Soviet Union provided, or Ukraine received resources, particularly oil and gas, from the Soviet Union, and then even after independence on a subsidized basis from Russia. And two of the most prominent leaders of the Soviet Union in the last 30, 40 years before its dissolution were either from Ukraine, Brezhnev, or had been the leader of Ukraine, Khrushchev. And Kiev is accurately described as sort of the birthplace of what became Russian civilization. And all during those years, the Ukraine had been sometimes part of a Russian empire, sometimes part of Western empires, in particular Poland for a very long time. A lot of Western Ukraine was part of a Polish empire, and for periods of time, part of a Mongol or Muslim empires. So that's the history of Ukraine before 1991. And then we can turn to the next slide. In 1993, a international affairs expert at Harvard wrote an article for the Foreign Affairs Quarterly entitled "The Class of Civilizations," and then the article was both so controversial and so popular that he wrote a book. And I went back to look at whether he had said anything about the Ukraine in that 1993 book. And this is what he wrote, and you can read along with me. The fault lines between civilizations, and he's now talking in 1993, the fault lines between civilizations are replacing the political and ideological boundaries of the Cold War as flashpoints for crisis and bloodshed. The most significant dividing line in Europe may well be its eastern boundary of Western Christianity in 1500. The line cut through Belarus and Ukraine, separating the more Catholic Western Ukraine from the Orthodox Eastern Ukraine, and you can say parenthetically in Russia. And then go to the next slide. The peoples to the west of this line are Protestant or Catholic. And the west of this line, of course, is Western Ukraine, Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Western Europe. Are Protestant or Catholic, they share the common experience of European history, feudalism, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. The people to the east of this line, and that would be the eastern part of Ukraine and Russia, are Orthodox or Muslim. They historically belonged to the Ottoman or Tsarist empires and were only lightly touched by the shaping events in the rest of Europe. They seem much less likely to develop stable democratic political systems. The velvet curtain of culture has replaced the iron curtain of ideology as the most significant dividing line in Europe. What's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that, to the story we'll tell next week, is that the United States was probably, when communism collapsed, there was a sort of almost a conventional wisdom at the time, was that this was going to be a great opportunity to integrate Russia into Western Europe and to make it democratic and to make it free market oriented. That view largely ignored the civilizational differences between Russia and the United States. It resulted in the United States being profoundly disappointed when Russians didn't react necessarily in the way we expected. Of course, the introduction of free markets in Russia was a disaster. In fact, it's interesting fact I didn't realize, even today, the Ukraine, in terms of its recovery from the collapse of communism, the per capita GDP in Ukraine on an inflation-adjusted basis has yet to regain where it was before 1991. The Russians have done better than that, thanks to their oil and gas primarily. Let me turn to the next slide. what are the differences between Russian civilization and our civilization that we need to keep in mind in trying to understand? Well, first of all, they were formed by three sources. There were Viking invaders from the north that came down through Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and south, and helped form what became the earliest part of the Russian civilization around 700, and it was in Kiev. There were Slavic peoples that already lived in that area, and there was a Byzantine tradition from the south, because the Viking forces actually reached far enough to come in contact with what was the remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, governed by Orthodox Christianity. And Orthodox Christianity is a very different Christianity than what was then Catholic Christianity. And it had different traditions. I mean, I remember I was in Russia in, I think it was 1996, and went to an Orthodox service in a very sacred place about 40 miles outside of Moscow, and was amazed because the entire service, almost the entire service, occurred behind a wall where only the priest could participate or see what was happening. And every now and then the wall would part and the priest would come out and say or do something to the congregation, then go back behind the wall. And I was told at the time that that was emblematic of the difference between Western Christianity and Orthodox Christianity, that whereas in our services, and it wasn't in our services, the service occurs openly in front of all the congregation so you can see what's happening and participate. In Orthodox Christianity, the interaction between the priest and God occurs private, behind closed doors, and you're not part of it. The other thing, if you remember the quote we read from Huntington, referred to one of the events that shaped Western civilization that didn't shape Russian civilization, at least as much, was feudalism. And Quigley in his book explains something that never occurred to me, but explains a political difference, political philosophical difference between Russia and the West. During the Dark Ages, when all nation states in the West basically collapsed, and what authority and power existed was at a private level on an almost transactional basis between lord and serfs. Western civilization learned in that time that even if a nation or a state or a government doesn't exist, a society can still function and can still have rules. And indeed, the rules may come from something other than the state itself. The rules may rise up from the interaction of people at the grassroots. That apparently never occurred in Russia. They never had a Dark Ages of where there was no government. And as a consequence, the political concepts, and this is true not only in Russia, but probably also well in China, is the distinction we draw between the state and society and between the individual and states are less pronounced in other civilizations or cultures. As a consequence, that constant line between individual rights and group responsibility and your responsibilities to the group are much less a focus, at least traditionally in Russian civilization or in Chinese civilization, than they are in the West. Second thing, Russia has never had a democracy. Never as the Russian Empire, never as the Soviet Union, never before. Russia's never really experienced a democracy. The only time it had anything coming close to a real democracy was in those few years in the 1990s. So there's not a lot of history or experience with democracy in Russia. Next, Russia has been profoundly insecure. It was invaded 3 times by the West. once by Napoleon, twice by Germany. It's been invaded from the north. It's been invaded from the south by the Mongols, from the west by the Muslims, from the west by the Mongols. And the plain that the Ukraine is on, and Russia and Moscow, is a wide open plain to the west that makes it very difficult to have a defensive line. They certainly don't have an Atlantic Ocean that separates them from their nearest enemy, and they don't even have an English Channel to do that. And I think it's a generality, but true, that a nation that's subject to those kinds of security threats has a tendency to become more authoritarian, just as most nations, including democracies, become more authoritarian in times of war. Let me go to the next slide. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there developed a theory in American foreign policy that became really the dominant theory, and that it has been the dominant theory in our foreign policy establishment for most of the period since then. A book was written back then by a professor who was then at Johns Hopkins called The End of History. And the thesis of the book was that democracy and free markets had proven that they were the best system in the world, had prevailed over all others, and that all of the world was going to become democratic and free market oriented. And that's why this was supposedly the end of history. We had come to the point where what was called then the Washington Consensus was perceived as going to prevail all around the world. And indeed, at that time, it was a unipolar world, meaning there was only one great power, and that was the United States. And however realistic or accurate that vision was, at that period of time, we actually had the power to start to try to realize it. And we developed a foreign policy that was developed largely on the proposition that the expansion of democracy and free markets creates peace. That theory has not really been proven empirically, and I got to say I don't think that it's actually played out that way. It was the theory that was largely behind the Iraq War, that we were going to remake the Middle East into a democracy. But the problem with that theory is that it is perceived by other nations, or particularly other civilizations, nations that are parts of other civilizations, as being a threatening theory. Because what we are proposing, if they are not democracies, is that they need to be changed, and that it is our policy to change them. And we were very express about that was our policy, to support political change, understandably, to support political change, to promote liberal democracies around the world. And I think that's a great objective. I guess the question is how you do it. But what we didn't appreciate, perhaps, is how threatening that would be perceived by other countries. There are two, what I'll call minority dissents from that theory. The one is Huntington's civilizational theory that we just talked about. Huntington reacted to that, to the end of history theory, and what's called the liberal hegemony theory, that we're going to spread democracy all around the world, that it was inevitable that the world would embrace our democratic and economic ideals, and said that that theory underestimated the civilizational differences that divided countries. Then there was a realist theory that opposed that on the grounds that values and legal rules almost never prevail over nationalism and national interest. And if our promotion of democracy and free markets is perceived by countries to which it is addressed as being directed at changing them. And if it's perceived as being inconsistent with their national interest or the interest of their ruling class, then they will fight against it. And the failures of the liberal hegemony have been evident. The other aspect of that theory was the support of color revolutions in the Middle East and also in the Ukraine. And in each situation, the color revolutions in the Middle East basically failed. We went into Libya thinking that we were going to free it from Gaddafi, and we turned it into a hellhole. Iraq, same thing happened. Egypt, most of the color revolutions didn't play out the way we had hoped, maybe expected that they would. And we specifically threatened Russia with a color revolution in Moscow that was going to take Putin out of power. And we'll get to that next week. And then let me turn to the next slide. This is the last thing I'll talk about. These are the two things that were at the heart of the beginning of our policy in 1991. I'm going to take the second one first. In 1991, the Soviet Union had not yet come apart. And the Ukrainian parliament had been given the power by Gorbachev to make a decision as to whether to become an independent nation within the Confederation of Independent States that was being proposed. Now, Gorbachev was still at power at that time, and of course, the United States was very supportive of Gorbachev. And George H.W. Bush and Barbara and Secretary Baker, I think, also went to Moscow to try to bolster Gorbachev's position in the Soviet Union, which still existed. And on his way back, he stopped in Kiev to give a speech to the Ukrainian parliament before they made their decision on whether to become an independent nation. And he urged them not to. He warned them against, quote, suicidal nationalism in a speech that was written largely by Condoleezza Rice. Because at that time, and I think accurately, the United States perceived that the dissolution of the Soviet Union into independent nations would create an instability that would come back to haunt us for a long period and create all sorts of challenges for us. That's why George H.W. Bush was in Kiev trying to convince the Ukrainians to stay in the Soviet Union. Now, he got lambasted in the press after giving that speech. One of the conservative hardline militants called it the Chicken Kiev speech. But that will show you where our country's policy was at that point. And I think accurately that George H.W. Bush and Secretary Baker appreciated the problems that were going to be created for us in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The second thing is a recent book just came out this year called Not One More Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of the Post-Cold War Stalemate. Now, you remember when the Berlin Wall fell, the question was whether West Germany and East Germany would be reunited. And both the Soviet Union and the United States had some mixed feelings about whether that should happen, but generally the United States was in favor of it. The Russians, of course, still had troops in East Germany, and we're going to have to withdraw those troops from East Germany if the reunification was to occur. Secretary Baker met with Gorbachev to discuss the reunification of Germany. And he posed the following question, and this is from the transcripts of that meeting in declassified records from the United States. And these records were only declassified, I think, a couple years ago. The Clinton administration or former members of the Clinton administration fought for years to try to keep a lot of the records during the 1990s about relations with Russia classified. But Baker said to Gorbachev, would you prefer to see a united Germany outside of NATO, independent and with no US forces, or would you prefer a unified Germany to be tied to NATO with assurances that NATO's jurisdiction would not shift 1 inch eastward from its present position? And of course, its present position was on the borderline between East Germany and West Germany. Gorbachev responded that yes, he would rather the latter than the former. And based on that understanding, the Russians, the Soviet Union at the time, withdrew their troops from East Germany, allowed the reunification of Germany, and then subsequently after that started freeing the Warsaw Pact nations from their obligations and gave them independence. Based upon what Gorbachev claims was his understanding that the United States would not allow NATO to expand 1 inch eastward. Of course, in the subsequent decade, we expanded up to the Ukrainian border. Now, there were very compelling reasons for that expansion. I am not of the view that that expansion was necessarily a mistake. In fact, I don't think anybody could know whether it's a mistake, because to judge whether it was a mistake or not, you'd have to engage in a counterfactual history and decide what would have happened had we not expanded NATO. But I will say this, Foreign Affairs Quarterly just did a survey of about 20 foreign affairs experts on the question of was it a mistake to expand NATO. I forget what the exact breakdown was, but I think it was like 11 said it wasn't a mistake and they thought it was the right thing to do. I think a couple were neutral and the balance thought it was a mistake. One of the people, but of all the people who advocated for the expansion of NATO eastward during the 1990s, none of them, and no one until George W. Bush, against the advice of all of his advisors and in opposition to the position of every other European nation, in 2008, had NATO issue a declaration that Ukraine and Georgia, the other former Soviet state, would become the next members of NATO. He issued that declaration in 2008, 1 year after Gorbachev had given a speech in Munich in 2007. And not Gorbachev, Putin had given a speech in 2007 in Munich saying that the inclusion of Ukraine into NATO would be a red line for Russia. And that's where I'll end. I'm sorry that I went so long, and I'm happy to take as long as you want to respond to any questions, comments, disagreements, or whatever.
We do try to hold these classes to an hour and 15 minutes, but what a tremendous amount of information was shared, and certainly a lot to absorb. If you do have a question or comment that you would like to make, we could continue this for a few minutes. If you would use under reactions at the bottom of your screen, the raise hand button, you'll pop to the upper left of the screen and I'll call on you and you could unmute yourself.
Dave, I just want to say I am absolutely flabbergasted with the detail and the history, and it's absolutely fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you, but let me also encourage people who want to disagree with me, because I think that's very important. I don't think there are any right or wrong answers as to how this should be handled. And again, I'll go back and say, I think the Biden administration is generally doing the right thing. But I do think it's important for us to understand the context, which is what I was trying to explain today. But if
There'll be an opportunity after next week's class for further question discussion, perhaps as what we've learned tonight begins to sink in, and some of us may even do a little independent research to follow up on some of Dave's points. There'll be an opportunity for more dialogue next week. So we look forward to having you all join us again. If you know people who would have liked to be here, or now that you have heard Dave's presentation, you would like to share it with others, this program has been recorded, and the recording will be added to the Westminster YouTube channel by tomorrow. So it will be available. So if there are people who missed tonight that you know of, and would like to catch up, please advise them to go to the Westminster YouTube channel, which can be reached via our website, www.wpc.org. And we will look forward to seeing you and them next week. Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate it, especially that you weren't feeling well and you did a wonderful, wonderful job. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And let me again say, I just encourage people to debate with me, because it's a subject that deserves debate. I think there should be, I know there are people who will disagree with some of what I said. And I really encourage you to speak out. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Okay. How to get out of here.